Hello, everybody. Welcome back to this video series. I'm Father Kevin. We've been doing this series. I started this new series on virtue. So, talking about in general, how do you live life? Yeah, we know we're supposed to, I guess, be good people and love Jesus and all that, but how does that actually kind of look like on a practical level? And that's what we're unpacking with this series on virtue. That from Greek philosophy taken up into Christianity, we have this rich tradition applying of how to apply sort of the values of Christianity, of how do we live? How do we live the teachings of Christ? So I talked in the last couple of videos about it's all about bringing order to our soul and thus to the world around us to find that balance, the healing, that we can live rightly. So today I want to talk about specifically getting into the meat of potatoes, what is virtue? What is virtue? We sometimes throw that term around and have various ideas of what virtue is or what it is to be virtuous. Kind of the definition of virtue is a good habit or a habit towards the good. So I don't mean like a good habit as in like brushing your teeth every day. It's a good habit, lest your teeth be gross. um, but it's a habit towards the good that we habituate or it becomes second nature, the inclination to just do the good thing. And this is really important because sometimes we think in our little day-to-day things, that if we may be a jerk in this situation, it's not that big a deal because when push comes to shove, I'll be a really good person. Well, maybe. The more we habituate our soul, it's in those really difficult and challenging circumstances that we can heroically do the good. I'm always moved by those, you see those things on the news about this person who, I don't know, I remember the news a few years ago, someone fell on a subway train, rail car train, having a seizure. And another guy jumped down as a train was coming, jumped down on the train and like held the guy down so he wouldn't accidentally flail and roll over and get crushed by the train. Who would do that, It's obviously because I'd like to think in the moment, yeah, I'd be all heroic in the moment, but would I? It comes from when we, in those little ways, live into that type of person that we're called to be. So this is the idea of virtue. It's that living in the day to day, in the little moment, cultivating those habits towards the good. That then, in the big moments that really matter, I mean, every moment matters, but we do that when we're under pressure and everything, that we do what's right and good, even in the most difficult of circumstances. Okay, so this is a habit towards the good. So just like any habit, the more we do it, the easier it gets. So just like when we start lifting weights, when we first start, it's really hard. Or if we're out of shape when we start running, it's really hard. But the more we do it, the easier and more natural it becomes because we become accustomed to it. Or eating healthy, when I first started trying to eat a little more healthy, I remember I went on a kick. I wasn't eating so healthy. I eat more vegetables and spinach. Ugh. But then the more you do it, you start to like crave those healthy foods and not crave so much the really sugary foods. For me, it was with coffee. Actually, my gateway into coffee was gas station cappuccinos, which now, while I still like my sweet coffee, I've grown to start drinking more and more like coffee that's not so sweet. And come to really appreciate that. And now all of a sudden, those cheap gas station cappuccinos, they taste a little too sugary and syrupy for me. Anyways, that's an example. We start cultivating ourselves, inclining ourselves towards that thing. Or there's a verse in the letter of St. James in the Bible that says, resist the devil and he will flee from you. Now, this doesn't mean that the more virtuous we are, we'll never have temptation. But like I'm getting at is the more we incline ourselves towards the good and cultivate that habit, the easier it becomes to do the good in the moment. Like it becomes more and more second nature. And that's what virtue is about. Getting goodness into our very nature. Okay. So, for an example, there could be two people who could be in the same situation and the same end result that they both do the right thing. So, for example, say two You guys are at work. Someone accidentally leaves out a couple $100 bills on their desk and walks away. And there's guy number one. Guy number one, he looks around. He realizes, I could take that money. It really helped me out. No one would know it was me. It's just cash. No one could trace it to me. It's really tempting. And he really struggles and really thinking about this. And he starts kind of walking away. And then he's like, and then he starts turning back and reaching towards the money. And he's like, no, I shouldn't do that. He starts walking away. And then he starts reaching again. And then, no, I shouldn't do that. And finally, eventually, he's like, nope, it's wrong. And he walks away. That's guy number one. Take guy number two, who sees the money, thought pops in his head like, someone could swipe that money, but then passes right through his mind and he doesn't even think about it. He doesn't even, not even hardly tempted to take the money. Now, at the end of the day, guy one and guy two, they both did the right thing, both good people. The difference between guy number one and guy number two is guy number two had virtue. It was virtuous, that he had developed the inclination that when the moment of temptation came, it kind of passed right over him. Whereas guy number one still did the right thing, but still obviously had to grow in that particular virtue of not greediness. I can't think of what the word would be for virtue, but in that moment. So that's kind of the idea of what virtue is, cultivating ourselves towards the good. So it becomes easier to do who we're called to be. So even when two people in a situation do the right thing, one may be more virtuous than the other, even with the same end result. So that's what it's about, strengthening our soul. Now, many times a virtue is, when we look at the virtues, it's a virtue is usually, it's not usually just the good side of the bad thing. It's usually a balance between two extremes. The virtue is the balance in the middle. For example, the virtue of courage would be the balance between the vice, as we call the extremes, the extreme of cowardice, being a scaredy cat and afraid and not doing it, or foolhardiness might be a word for it, sometimes brashness. So a soldier in a field, be courageous. It's not that they're not scared, but they face their fear. A coward would just like run away. The other extreme is the foolhardiness, that I'm just going to run into it, without any weapons or armor and not even have any regard for my own safety. But courage is the virtuous balance in the middle, assessing the danger and doing what's right in it anyways. Or another example, the virtue of, I don't know what you call it, right eating, if you will, would be an extreme between gluttony and starving oneself, right? That eating correctly, we can overeat, and that's one bad extreme. And the other bad extreme is like anorexia. I'm just going to starve myself to an unhealthy degree. And it's about balancing, finding that balance in the center. That's virtue, and that's what we're striving for. Another example, diligence, being a good worker. That is a virtue. The virtuous balance in the middle is, on the one hand, laziness is one extreme, or just, I'm lazy and I don't do anything, sloth. Or the other extreme is I'm a total workaholic, to an unhealthy extreme. It's finding the virtuous balance in the middle. Now, and I think that's really helpful in understanding, because many times, whoever we are, it's in these different virtues or things we struggle with, we often tend towards one extreme as opposed to the other. So knowing that about ourselves, it can help us to know how we need to structure our lives and what we need to hone in on to cultivate virtue. Okay, so I want to say a little more. These extremes, as I was talking about, these extremes we call vices. So, and vices, you may know the word vice means something that binds. I would help my dad in the shop, and we had the vice on the workbench, that you crank and it clamps down on the thing, and you crank it really tight so it holds something really solidly in place. It's a vice, or a vice grips, the nifty little pliers thing that can lock close to hold on to something. And it's called a vice for a reason, because even the ancients, and then in Christianity, it's seen that, the basically sin, or these extremes we tend towards, these vices, tend to bind us, that they lock us in, that they keep us from being free. Whereas when we find the balance of the virtue, it's when we're truly free to be human, to be good. As I was talking about the man who with the money, the one who was like, he clearly was bound by this desire to steal that money, even though he ended up doing the right thing. He clearly was, it was much more of a struggle for him. Whereas the other man was much more free. Doesn't even faze me. This is what Jesus wants to help us to do, to free us, to break us free from bondage. We talk about, like, the Bible uses the language of being freed from the enslavement of sin and death. Because this is a real experience. The more we're in sin, there is this feeling of, I am bound by this sin, that I fall into it again and again. But the great news, the gospel, Jesus wants to free you from all that. So all this that I'm talking about, it's not merely our own work, though it certainly does involve our cooperation. But there's grace in Jesus's work in all this too. So you think about these vices enslaving us. More extreme examples: alcoholics, someone with an eating disorder, sex addict, or even when we get those cravings when we're not hungry, we just kind of start mindlessly eating. We're not exactly operating out of freedom there. So there's all these different vices, and Jesus wants to set us free. Now, in the Christian tradition, there's been a list of particular vices that are sort of seen as the overarching dominant vices, which everything else is a subcategory, commonly called is the 7 deadly sins. Lust, pride, anger, gluttony, sloth, envy, and greed. And those are kind of seen as the dominant vices, which everything else is involved. And the more we can help identify which one of those we struggle with, or which category we're in that we struggle with the most, the more we can figure out what virtue we need to hone in on. Now, I'm not going to go into depth right now into the 7 deadly sins. I just wanted to mention them. Okay, so the last thing I want to say, sorry, this is getting longer than I intended, but vices ultimately at the end of the day make us miserable. That's why we're striving for virtue, for happiness, for purpose. I knew someone who, they were talking to me once, and they just had, it's so obvious to me, all these things that bound their life. They were sleeping around, they were living the party life all the time, getting hammered drunk. And, oh, by the way, there was this person who severely hurt them, who they just, hated. They told me that straight up hated. And to me, talking to this person, it was so obvious. Oh, and this person, by the way, was miserable. But they didn't understand why. Whereas to me, it was so obvious. And I don't say this is a judgmental way at all. I love this person dearly, and it's not a judgment. But it was so obvious that these choices they were making, these vices, were making them miserable, were weighing them down, especially the resentment piece, the hatred. It was just like this great binding, weighty burden on their life. And so virtue has set us free to be joyful and happy. Now, this doesn't mean that a virtuous person is never going to suffer. Not at all. Of course we're going to suffer. But to be able to not create unnecessary misery for yourself and others, and to heroically instead take on the suffering in our lives and on the world in a heroic way, that we become a force of good even in the face of great torment, as Jesus talked about building our house on rock. So, recap: virtue, habit towards the good. It's a balance between extremes. Vices bind us, make us unhappy. Virtues set us free. So that's the takeaway. Tune in again for more on virtue. Thank you for listening, and we'll talk to you later. Peace. God bless.